أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وصلى الله على محمد وآله عليهم السلام Usini wa iyyakum bitaqwa Allah. I call myself and all of those mu'mineen and mu'minat who are present towards taqwa, piety, and the fear of Allah. Dear brothers and sisters in Iman, scholars, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'd like to just spend a few minutes that we have together and contemplating on these verses of Surah Fatir. These are verses 44 and the preceding verses of that surah. Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أولم يسيروا في الأرض فينظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلهم وكانوا أشد منهم قوة وما كان الله ليعجزه من شيء في السماوات ولا في الأرض إنه كان عليما قديرا صدق الله العلي العظيم وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله. Allah in these verses tells us to go and travel in the earth and to look at how and what the ultimate end of those who came before us was, and to contemplate on the fact that those people might have actually been stronger than us or than the people that the Quran is addressing. And Allah says, He reminds the readers of these verses and those who claim that they will change their ways if only Allah sends His guidance, that Allah is not held back, His hands are not tied, and He is not made to be unable by anything in the heavens and the earth. Indeed, Allah is both all knowledgeable and all capable. He is both omniscient and omnipotent. Allah tells us in one way that we should be aware of our own history and in the history of other people in His creation. And we should take a lesson from those other people, not just in their actions and in their responses to Allah's guidance, but as well in how Allah deals with those people when both they reject and when they accept. These verses are in a larger context. It is the context in which Allah mentions in the previous verse, وَأَقْسَمُوا بِاللَّهِ جَهْدَ أَيْمَانِهِمْ لَإِنْ جَاءَهُمْ نَذِيرٌ لَيَكُونَنَّ أَهْدَى مِنْ إِحْدَى الْأُمَمِ. Some of our mufassirun say that these verses are talking about the people of Quraysh, the people of the city of Mecca, the people of the Prophet, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi. That they would swear that if only Allah would send them a messenger, a warner. This is before the Prophet was revealed to them, was sent to them. That if a prophet came to them, like prophets had been sent to other peoples, like the Banu Israel and the Nasara, the Christians, then they would as well follow the guidance of Allah. Not only that, but they might even follow that guidance better. لَيَكُونَنَّ أَهْدَى مِنْ إِحْدَى الْأُمَمِ. Not just that they would follow the guidance, but they would actually do a better job if they were put in the same position as the people who came before. In other words, they would be more willing to sacrifice for that guidance of Allah if they were placed in that and given that same trial, if they were placed in those same circumstances. But then, however, when that guidance came, when they were placed in that moment of difficulty and they were asked to sacrifice, فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ نَذِيرٌ, مَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا نُفُورًا. When that guide, when that warner came to them, what happened to them? They were only people who would flee away from that guidance. They wouldn't give the sacrifice that they were called for and called to. They only tried to deal with their own lives and continue as they had done. Istikbaran fil ard wa makra sayyi. And then Allah continues. Why did they do this? Because they were haughty, because they were arrogant. And also because maybe they did not take a lesson from those earlier people. And so Allah tells us that we should know our own history and understand what happened to the people who came before. And Allah mentions this not just as a neutral fact, that we should learn about history, we should contemplate history, just so that we can gain some additional knowledge that we can just store in our minds and then move on with our lives. No, there are certain lessons that we have to gain from this history. First, of course, this history gives us perspective and it gives us context. In particular, when we are thinking about the recent events, if we did not know the history of the land of Gaza or of Greater Palestine in general, we would have thought that as soon as the news came on, as soon as the media began to cover that part of the world, and that's when the events began. But if you know the context of what has been going on according to some historians, for 100 years now, this constant state of occupation, this constant state of oppression, of considering a people foreign to their own homes and to their own land. This idea that we can erase the identity, the claims of a people to their own homes, of destroying their homes and destroying their history. It gives us perspective once we understand what has been going on in Gaza just in the past 20 years. How many times have there been bombardments, attacks on that just small strip of land? Then we can understand, well, why did this happen at this point? We might not have all of the details, but at least we can get a better understanding of the conflict, or rather the suffering and the tragedy that is happening to the people of Gaza. And it also, again, gives us perspective. It can give us, if we understand history, it can give us perspective that tragedy, despite the difficulty, and not to diminish what has been happening to the people of Gaza, or the people of the West Bank, or any part of larger Palestine. All of the people who have been killed, all of the people who have been displaced, who have been injured. Last night I mentioned the statistic, the latest statistic that we had, about 10,500 people or so were killed. That was the statistic we had last night. Today, that number has gone up to over 11,000. Just in a matter of a few hours, if you can only imagine what is going on the ground. That is an incomprehensible amount of suffering, of death, of tragedy that is happening. But if we understand history, we understand as well that not to diminish the tragedy, but also to put it in perspective. That tragedies have occurred in the past, but people ultimately have to move on. They have to bury their dead, and they have to find a better solution for their own futures. And that is really what we have to strive to. What is the solution to this tragedy? How can we rectify the wrongs that have been incurred upon the people of Gaza and Greater Palestine? So, tragedy is not the end. Suffering is not the end. We shouldn't lose hope. And it's very difficult to keep hope alive and to be hopeful when you see those images or you see those videos of little children being killed. But ultimately, history allows us to see the larger perspective, that Allah is still watching over us, and He will one day, in the way that He knows best, show us the ultimate solution to this tragedy. And that is another lesson that we can take from history, that despite all of the suffering, despite all of the evil that spreads throughout the land, despite oppressors thinking that they can do whatever they will, we know that Allah is still watching over these events. And these are the words that Allah Himself mentions in ayah number 45 of Surah Fatir. وَلَوْ يُؤَاخِذُ اللَّهُ النَّاسَ بِمَا كَسَبُوا مَا تَرَكَ عَلَى ظَهْرِهَا مِنْ دَابَّةٍ وَلَكِنْ يُؤَخِّرُهُمْ إِلَى أَجَلٍ مُسَمًّى. If Allah took the oppressors, if Allah, He stopped them, or He held them to account right when they committed that oppression, then no one will be left on the earth. No one will be left, no human, because ultimately we all, not to say that we're equating the two, but on some level we are all sinning against, some of us are better at it than others, but many of us make mistakes. And Allah gives us a reprieve. He gives us some time for us to correct our errors, for those who have the potential to correct them, and for those who don't, then Allah allows them to realize and actualize their ultimate potential for oppression. However, Allah says that وَلَكِنْ يُؤَخِّرُهُمْ إِلَىٰ أَجَلٍ مُسَمًّى. It is only for a time. Not to say that Allah has turned away from humankind, but He only allows that reprieve, that time, that pause for a particular time. فَإِذَا جَاءَ أَجَلُهُمْ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ كَانَ بِعِبَادِهِ بَصِيرًا. When that time comes, when that appointed time comes, then Allah is surely watching over all of His creation, all of His servants. And so when the time comes, and Allah of course is saying it here in terms of the effect of what will come. For those who are oppressors, then they will be held to account for the oppression that they have committed. And for those who are oppressed, they will as well be taken out of that state of oppression, and they will now be given the opportunity to either commit the good or to commit the evil that they would and that they will. And finally, this gives us, again, we said it gives us history, an understanding, context, and the events leading up to a tragedy and a conflict and a crisis, allows us, first of all, the context, better understand the situation on the ground. Secondly, it gives us perspective, and it gives us a sense that Allah is watching over us. It allows us to have that hope in the will and the grace of Allah. And then finally, once we have that will and that grace, then we can take solace that Allah will fulfill His promise. And we ask Allah for Him to fulfill that promise, to take all of those oppressed and to allow them to inherit the earth and to spread light and guidance throughout His creation. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد صلى الله عليه وسلم. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أرسله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون أوصيني وإياكم بتقوى الله وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. I seek forgiveness for my own shortcomings and for the shortcomings of all of the mu'mineen and mu'minat present, and I call myself and all of you towards taqwallah and the fear of Allah. I will just keep my second khutbah short, and I will begin with this one hadith that we hear a lot of times, but it becomes very real and very relevant in our current situation. This is a hadith reported from Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam. In which the Imam is asked, وَقَدْ سُئِلَ أَيُّهُمَا أَفْضَلُ الْعَدْلُ أَوِ الْجُودُ. The Imam is asked which one is better, which one has greater fadila, which one has greater value. Is it adl, justice, or is it jud? Is it generosity and giving out to someone even more than or even before they ask? The Imam replies by saying, Al-adl yada'ul umur mawadi'aha wal-jud yakhrujuha or yukhrijuha min jihatiha. The Imam responds, he says, Adl places things in their proper place. However, Jud, it takes those things out of their appropriate place, of course, for a higher aim. And then the Imam says, Al-Adl sa'isun am wal-Jud aridun khas. فَالْعَدْلُ أَشْرَفُهُمَا وَأَفْضَلُهُمَا. Adl can be a sort of a general policy that we can have to establish our society, and whereas Jud, generosity, giving and forgiving, is something that we can apply on an individual basis. And so therefore, Adl is more noble, it is greater than the two of them. In other words, when we want to establish our society, we want to establish it based on justice, not necessarily based on forgiving wrongs that have been righted. Yes, of course, Jud has a place, both in our personal relationships as well as in larger society, in politics and so on. But ultimately, we have to know where things lie, where the appropriate place for those things are. When we are thinking about, as I mentioned, we want to have perspective. In times of crisis, in times of tragedy, we want to keep that perspective in mind. When we think about the current situation, we want to think about what are the solutions out of this crisis and out of this tragedy. Sometimes, and this is our responsibility, part of that perspective is to say that not how can I bring about that solution? How can I further, for example, ending this tragedy? But the question is, what is my responsibility? I am not an individual who has power over all of Allah's creation. Allah ultimately decides. And He says in those verses of Surah Fatir, فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. Allah has His own sunan, His own habits, His own wants for His creation. And He is going to fulfill those habits, those sunan, according to His wisdom. I can only determine what place I fill in that larger sunnah. Not to delay that sunnah or to bring that sunnah closer, but in terms of fulfilling my responsibility in view of that sunnah, in view of that history that Allah is writing for all of human creation. And so when we think about what are the solutions to this crisis, first of all, I have to think about, well, what is it that I can do? Yes, there are plenty of solutions that are mentioned. There's the one-state solution, there's the two-state solution, and so on and so forth. But what is my responsibility here? And my responsibility is in terms of both my knowledge of the facts on the ground, as well as how much power and how much ability I have to further those solutions. So for example, some of us might say that we can call our representatives, or we can talk to our co-workers or our classmates or our friends, or we can go and attend protests. In each one of these situations, we have to really know what is my stance in terms of this crisis. Sometimes we might say that, for example, calling for a ceasefire, calling for these humanitarian pauses. Well, what is the end result? You have a ceasefire and then you continue the same situation that had led up to this crisis. Is that our ultimate goal? We sometimes say that there's a two-state solution. If you talk to people on the ground, recently the director of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, he talks about this, that people in the UN, they know that the two-state solution is just a joke. It's not actually what can be affected on the ground. You have, according to some reports, according to even Israeli policy institutes, you have over 400,000 settlers in the West Bank. You have, according to other international rights groups, you have over 600,000 settlers in the West Bank. Over 100,000 hectares of land that have been appropriated from the Palestinians. 50,000 homes have been demolished in the past few decades. So many people have been killed. Only in the last few years we have seen what's happened in Gaza. Again, if you look at history, you will have a better perspective of what the possible solutions could be. If you look at other examples of settler colonial societies, you see, for example, our own state, our own country, a country that was established based on colonizing a land of another people, of erasing their history, of their identity, changing the names of their cities, and killing many of them, and forcing the displacement of many of them. Ultimately, the solution came down to that those people were subjugated and they were erased. In other examples of this type of policy, you have examples in Algeria, examples in South Africa, and other parts of Africa at large. You have places where the settler colonialists, the settlers, ultimately went back to their own homes, their own country. So you have different possibilities. The ultimate thing that one of the best things that I think we can all call for, whether we're talking to our representatives or talking to our co-workers, of course, is not just to stop at a ceasefire, but it is to call for an end to the occupation. But even beyond that, it is to give a voice to the people whose homes are being taken away, the people whose children are being killed. What do they want? Are they even given a seat at the table? Or are we the ones who are deciding who is going to determine their fate? Give a voice to the Palestinians themselves. Ask, what do they want? If somebody comes into my home and says that I am going to take, say, your kitchen and your basement and I'm going to imprison you in a part of your house, if I think that that's the best option for me, then I will say, okay, fine. But the principle is justice. The principle is to say that this is my home and I have a right to share it with someone else. This is my right and this is my responsibility. And so we should as well call for an end to an occupation and giving a voice to the people whose lands have been taken. Inshallah, may Allah end this crisis and may Allah end the occupation of the lands of Greater Palestine, and may Allah allow us the ability, the knowledge, and the will to help in the end to that occupation and in giving voice and possibility for the Palestinians to finally see an end to this, to their displacement. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا أعطيناك الكوثر فصل لربك وانحر إن شانئك هو الأبتر وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين وصلى الله على علي أمير المؤمنين وفاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين والحسن والحسين سيدي شباب أهل الجنة أجمعين وعلي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والحجة القائم المهدي عجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف. صلوا على محمد وعلى محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.